The member for Bowman.
Having worked for many years in the area of looking after the social impacts of gambling, Speaker, I never thought that I would be standing up here in the National Parliament speaking against a bill that ostensibly sets out to aid those who are affected by problem gambling. But the reality is that we do have a federal government that has made such an inordinate hash of this legislation, hasty and ill-conceived, that it's almost impossible for the average Australian to look at this bill and think that it will achieve anything and do anything other than waste a whole lot of money. Deputy Speaker, this is a highly complex issue and it deserved a whole lot more time than it's been given this month. This bill, the legislation, was released November 1. There was 1 week for a committee to take submissions and another week to consider those. This was a very, very rushed approach, and it really reflects a government that's virtually lost all policy direction. Now, there's plenty of history here with the member for Denison and the deals to become government, but this Prime Minister was going to do as much as she could to keep the vote of this one individual. And the moment this individual became irrelevant to the numbers to this government, Deputy Speaker, then of course the deal was off. It was Senator Nick Xenophon himself who says it just makes you wonder whether you can take the words of this Prime Minister with any level of trust at all. And the reality is that now that his requirements are not those of the government, he's been cast aside. What we have left then is this shelled-out carapace of a bill that has all the ugliest elements in it of government control and over-regulation, together with the very obvious element here that by remaining completely voluntary, it's almost impossible to see how this spending, in fact compelling industry to spend money, is going to have any impact on the problem whatsoever. We have the worst of both worlds, the completely overburdening regulation on those that run and operate gambling machines, and on the other hand, the reality that by being a voluntary system, a large number of our problem gamblers will simply not choose to participate. Let's go back, let's wind back a little bit. We know there's about 15,000 problem gamblers in the country. We know also that obviously gaming is a massive part of the local economy, and every one of us that come from different parts of Australia would know that the important contribution that clubs and in smaller towns that small pubs make to local economies. So obviously everyone here wants a balance. Instead, what we have is, as I've said, hasty and ill-conceived legislation that burdens upon every gaming operator these requirements to update the software in their systems, either by 2016 or, for those with less than 20 machines, I think 2020. This is a rapid rate that they are being expected to have these changes made to their machines, and it's virtually unaffordable to many of these clubs, and I think we're right to be deeply concerned. Keep in mind the economy isn't good. Keep in mind that clubs that were profitable as recently as 2 years ago are now genuinely struggling. Keep in mind that for the average club that has enormous overheads to cover, these gambling machines are the only thing that's actually keeping them afloat. They can't call in a few volunteers to work in a small club to help them through. They have to raise that revenue somewhere just to keep afloat and to keep doing the good work they do. Every dollar that they lose, that they pay to government, in what I'm calling the government's gambling tax, in the form of a gambling regulator, oh no, I hear everyone sigh, yes, another regulator, is just a dollar that doesn't go to community organisations in the local neighbourhoods of these clubs. So that's the dollar that's taken away by the government. Let me focus on 3 areas in the 10 minutes that I have. The first is the proposal last year of a mandatory pre-commitment trial right here in the ACT. Secondly, I want to look at some of the technical problems with the bill as it's been proposed. And then third, because I actually have obviously a regional and remote focus, how this legislation would affect the small communities around this great nation. Well, the ACT trial. I can remember a hastily cobbled together conference involving Jenny Macklin, Katie Gallagher and of course the head of Clubs ACT. And this was the first jurisdiction to agree to a proposed trial of mandatory pre-commitment technology. Now, of course, the individual members of Clubs ACT, I don't think were even told of the decision, and what we had was one individual, whom I won't name in this place, who probably has half an eye on their ALP membership and the other half on running for the Senate one day, presumably, cobbling together a deal so that just in case the Prime Minister had to wiggle out of this one with a pre-commitment trial somewhere, the ACT would back them up. So suddenly the coffers of the federal government opened up and they committed to every club that any financial loss as a result of mandatory pre-commitment would be compensated by the Commonwealth Government. How much would that be? Well, of course they didn't know, but they were fully exposing the Commonwealth Government to those costs. Then, of course, we had all of the clubs. Let's go through them. Ainslie Football Club, the Raiders Football Club. Let's go out to East Lakes, Woden Valley Rugby Union Club, Southern Cross Club, the Burns Club, all different configurations of clubs coming together and saying, what on earth are we doing here? Mandatory pre-commitment in the ACT so that anyone who's not terribly keen on that idea drives to Queanbeyan, and those who aren't too keen there just drive to the next town and gamble on the pokies there. That's right, ridiculous distortions across a jurisdictional boundary, but this was not about fixing the problem, Deputy Speaker. It was about a get-out-of-jail card for the Prime Minister so she could appease the then member for Denison. Of course, it all went pear-shaped and the clubs were in complete distress. Ainsley Football Club, I recall, had already written up a $600,000 annual loss for the previous financial year, and I have grave concerns that it could be 3 times as much this financial year. This club was in no position to have mandatory pre-commitment foisted upon them, but of course, together with every ACT club, that was exactly what was going to happen. That's assuming that this government even intended on carrying out this trial at all. No, it was a stopgap measure just in case they had to. It was a political solution to a problem of staying in government. Now, in the end, of course, this, like so many other government commitments, just evaporated away, because in the end, they weren't cornered, painted into a corner and forced to do it. So you know what? Of course, this government simply doesn't do it. And that proposal as an ACT trial never happened. I mean, just to move on from these grubby political deals and look at the technical complexity of walking into a club with between 20 and 200 machines and giving them a timeline for them to change over their machines and then telling them they're going to have to pay for it. I mean, let's remember that over 91 cents in the dollar is returned to the gamer. There's a small amount taken by the state government and a very, very small proportion that's retained by the operator of these machines. So they are, in many cases, barely viable. And what this government doesn't realise when it comes up with these grand plans of national regulation is that it's usually the smallest and most vulnerable clubs that are the most affected. And what we see is that in many cases the big guys are okay, but it's the small clubs that simply can't wear the burden of this additional requirement from the federal government. Now, of course, the plan sounds okay, doesn't it? We've all got a card and you can't go anywhere without using the card. You can sign up for the card if you want to. If you don't want to, you simply have no card. Therein lies the first big flaw. I have no problem with voluntary pre-commitment, but if you're going to mandatorily tell every club, casino and pub in the nation to wire up their systems, then you want to be getting a decent return on that massive, massive cost. And the reality is this is a federal government that had no money to spend, no will to give, and before you knew it, that's right, they were dreaming up yet another tax so that the operators themselves paid for all of these costs. These are free and independent operators being lumbered with another requirement. This is the Gillard government's dream of a massively regulated sector. In the end, and I have to keep going back to it being utterly voluntary, there was almost nothing one could do to engage a problem gambler who didn't want to be part of that pre-commitment. That hasty approach, and we've listened to Gaming Technology Australia, who said that you simply couldn't amortise those kind of requirements into the operations of many, many clubs in the years that were provided. But it's a government that hasn't listened. And if you go out to the small towns where there's very, very low numbers of machines, the great challenge for these smaller operators is to keep having a new machine. I mean, players get bored of old machines. So when you're a very, very small operator, replacing those machines regularly with new ones comes at extraordinary costs. So when you lay another regulatory burden on them, they simply can't turn over their machines, and gamers seek out those new machines and they go to larger venues with more games, more flashing lights, more hyperlink machines that are even more addictive, and it's the small providers who lose. Of course, that's all been lost in this government's rush towards this legislation. This has been a government that hasn't listened in the area. It's a government that's really turned gaming into a political pawn. They've only played the piece and moved them forward when it looked like they might lose government, and that's been the great tragedy. It's been yet another commitment that's been made in order to get the support of an independent member so that this government can sit on that side of the chamber. And this is an example where, given an opportunity to fix a problem, the scourge of problem gambling, instead what we're left with is horrible over-regulation, ultimately a voluntary system that everyone opt out of, and a completely unacceptable timeline for the businesses who in the end will wear the burden of this regulation.